Hey, I'm Nate Fosaaen. I'm a professional archaeologist currently excavating in northern Texas, and I specialize in the archaeology of North America prior to its colonization by Europeans, especially in the region that we call the Eastern Woodlands, where I've been working and doing most of my research for the last 10 years. On July 17th, we had International Ask an Archaeologist Day, which is one of those dumb made up internet holidays. But I made a Facebook post asking for questions, and I got some pretty good ones, so I'm going to try to answer some of those here. So, first, Joe asks, what are you hiding from the world at large? Inquiring minds and ancient aliens enthusiasts want to know. So, the only things that we really try to keep from the general public are specific site locations when the site is difficult to manage or oversee, because in North America especially, but pretty much everywhere, looting is a big problem. And people who go out and, dig up archaeological sites are looking for generally pristine artifacts that they can sell or put in shadow boxes on their mantelpiece. They're typically not looking for the kinds of information that we're looking for. For archaeologists, the broken artifacts are just as significant to us as the whole complete ones. And it's really more about what we find out than the actual things that we find. So we try to keep where sites are pretty hush hush until either they're fully mitigated or it gets turned into like an archaeological park and they can have some kind of oversight. I also haven't talked about some things that I would like to yet, but that's just because I have to get those things published and get my name on them before I start making, public access content, because stuff gets plagiarized all the time. Also, do look up the Crow Creek Massacre site. There's a lot of stuff going on there that not everyone's happy about being a reality. I mean, it's there, it's fact, but people don't really like it. So Adam asks, have Nazis ever tried to halt your progress? Adam, Nazis try to halt all of our progress every day. Rebecca asks, what question about archaeology do you wish people would ask but rarely do? So every archaeologist gets the same question every single time anyone finds out we're an archaeologist. What's the coolest thing you've ever found? And this kind of demonstrates the biggest misunderstanding that the general public has about what archaeologist is and what we do. It's, like I said, not about the artifacts. Really, it's about the information. By the way, the coolest thing that I've found has definitely been a paycheck that I earned by digging square holes and having fun playing outside. But the question really should be, what's the coolest thing you've learned from it in excavation? And those questions are going to be able to generate a much more interesting dialogue than what's the coolest thing you've found, because we're not antiquing. We're, trying to reconstruct how people's lives worked in the past. Kit asks, what is bones? Well, Kit, bones be a crystalline lattice of hydroxyapatite interwoven with collagen fibers. Kathy asks, how often do you and others find food-related matter in the Eastern Woodlands, and what do you find? It sounds like nut and acorn shells are common, and I guess there are traces of maize sometimes. Is it possible to know anything about meals or food preservation methods that they used regularly, or would that kind of thing only be educated guessing? So this is a really good question. So there are a couple of subdisciplines that deal with this kind of question very explicitly. One is zooarchaeology. That's the study of humans and their relationship with the animal kingdom in the archaeological past. So animal domestication, hunting, fishing, manufacturing of tools out of animal bones and antlers and shells, anything to do with how people were using animals as resources in the past. Also, things like totemism, mythology surrounding animals. These are all also interconnected, but more, I guess, non-traditional aspects of zooarchaeology. It's important to remember that with zooarch, though, there are several biases that we have to think about. So Like deer bones are big and robust, and they preserve really well as compared to squirrel bones, which are small and fragment very quickly and will degrade. So there are preservation biases we have to worry about. Also, very, very small elements. Typically, we're digging and screening through quarter-inch or sometimes eighth-inch screen mesh, so stuff doesn't always get collected. I saw one paper a few years ago where they decided to start putting a sample of their soil through I guess these fabric screens, and they were finding shrimp mandibles that they never would have found otherwise, and they suddenly realized, oh, we've got like a 5,000-year-old shrimping tradition off the coast of Georgia that we never knew that we had. So those kinds of biases we always have to keep in mind. Just because we are finding lots of deer doesn't mean they weren't also eating lots of other things. Preservation is differential across species and across elements. But we also look at things like, mussel shells are a big deal. Gastropod shells are sometimes important parts of the diet. There's a site that I worked on in Alabama where it very definitely looks like they're making a snail broth from both land and aquatic snails. So there's another subdiscipline called paleoethnobotany, and that's kind of the same thing but for plants. It's looking at how people use plant resources in the past. So the story that I always tell my students when I'm TAing is about this site that I did in Arkansas. We were digging in a either late paleo, early archaic kind of strata, and we were finding all of this charcoal. And there were little spots that were all about the same size, and I was kind of curious about what it was, so I took one and cut it in half, and it had this little M-shaped cross section, which if you've ever broken open a pecan shell or a hickory nut shell, that's what they look like. So we were able to get a couple of photos of that and show that even back then, it seems like mass resources, these hickory nuts, are already being used in the early archaic, maybe late paleo Indian period. It's hard to say for sure, but if we keep getting more of those, it'll lend more credence to that idea. There's also something that gets talked about a lot is the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and this is kind of the earliest innovation of domesticated plants in the eastern woodlands. And for that, we tend to find burnt seeds, things like burnt sunflower seeds, also burnt chenopodium, goosefoot, other kind of nutty, oily seeds, starchy seeds. We find also things like, think about wild grapes, those seeds burn and will preserve fairly well, persimmons, things like that. Maize agriculture is actually a fairly late onset thing. It doesn't show up until a little over 1,000 years ago. So it's the eastern woodlands had their own kind of plant-based diet that didn't involve maize until much later. Back to the meals and preservation methods, though, there are certainly a few things we can say here. First, ethnohistory is really useful. So when the first documents and artworks created by eyewitnesses of the native cultures that were here right as Europeans are first starting to come in, we have some documentation of what was going on beyond just oral histories. Sometimes they describe things that we can see in the archaeological record, and we can put two and two together there, like earth oven cooking that I talked about in the poverty point object video. There are also, in a couple of rare cases, like cookbooks. So Aggie Ross Lasaya was a Cherokee woman born in, I think, 1880, and her traditional recipes were published by the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in 1951. She was the granddaughter of a Cherokee chief who was kind of in charge of things until the 1830s, back when the Trail of Tears happened and a large group of the Cherokee were forced marched out to Oklahoma. So that's about as close to a primary source for like what the Cherokee were cooking and eating and how they were doing it as we're ever going to get. So lastly, there's also some experimental research. So for instance, Jerry Hilliard did some work with mass resources like acorns, trying to figure out how to make them preserve and keep and survive storage for long periods of time. And so with some experiments, he found that just really lightly roasting them is enough to dry them out and kill any parasites that are in there that might spoil the remainder. So these are some of the things that we're able to get at. Again, like there's always bias, there's always information that's missing. We kind of have to work with what we've got and kind of be aware that some things are not present, like think about like your leafy greens. Certainly, they must have been eating things like poke or something like that. But the these are not materials that will survive the archaeological record and the weathering process and the degradation over time. So that's something that we know they probably were eating, but we don't have any direct evidence for it. Um, Dr. Mary Vellante asks me to admit the truth about ancient aliens. I have never denied that the ancient aliens drinking game gets everyone involved grossly and irresponsibly drunk, and I will continue to preach that gospel for the remainder of my life. Um, Josh, how often are you carefully excavating something and think, "Shit, this is tedious"? How often are you excavating and super stoked about what you're uncovering? So at this point, it's really more about the process of excavation for me than anything else. Excavation is really about the trade skills like you would have with carpentry or masonry. And a lot of the satisfaction really comes from, cutting my walls straight, getting my excavation floors level, getting things, super clean and squared up and all of that. Getting like in a rhythm in the getting the beat for like when I can just kind of move dirt, and then when I start to find something like a fire pit or post holes or something structural and I need to slow down and start pedestaling things or working around. That's, I never really get frustrated with the super high precision stuff. Every now and again there will be an artifact that'll get me really excited about what I'm finding, but usually it's more about when things are in association with each other and I'm able to show that's kind of the real fun of it. I hope you all found this interesting, and as always, if you've got more questions, please leave those in the comments, and thank you for watching. Let's see, last one. Lindsay asks, do archaeologists have office drama? And if yes, spill the tea. I'm not going anywhere near that.